I remember the first time I really understood what wealth meant. It wasn't something that just appeared overnight. It was something built, something earned, and if you played your cards right, it could keep coming and coming until you were swimming in it. At least that's what we all thought. It was early in the 1600s. Amsterdam was buzzing, and I was just a young merchant trying to figure out how to get my hands on a piece of the pie. And oh, what a pie it was. Amsterdam was like a giant, throbbing heart of trade and money. There were ships coming in from all over, bringing spices from the East, silver from the Americas, and silk from the Orient. The Dutch East India Company was taking over the seas. Everyone was talking about it all the time. People couldn't shut up about it. The East Indies, they said, is where the money's at. The Dutch East India Company was the thing to invest in. If you didn't get in, well, you might as well have been a peasant. I didn't come from much, you know, just a regular guy trying to make it. But one thing I had going for me was ambition. And when I saw how these traders in big wigs were making fortunes off of this company, I knew I couldn't sit on the sidelines. It was too good to pass up. I'd heard of stocks before, but this was something else. Shares in the company? Couldn't believe it. You could buy a little piece of the company, and with each ship that came back loaded with riches, your share would grow. It was like magic. The more ships that came back, the richer you got. And I thought, why not me? Why not now? So I scraped together what I could, borrowed a bit from my cousin, he was into this stuff so he knew a guy, and I got my first share in the Dutch East India Company. I remember how it felt. Holding that paper in my hand, like I was suddenly part of something huge, like I was finally a part of the big leagues. It was a little piece of paper, but it might as well have been a golden ticket. And let me tell you, I wasn't the only one. It was the talk of the town. Everyone was getting in. It was the thing to do, and no one wanted to be left behind. At first, things were great. The company was expanding faster than you could say trade routes. Every ship that came back from the east, with its hold full of spices and goods, seemed to bring more money into the pockets of everyone involved. The shares kept going up, and up and up. People were saying things like, "You could retire with this stuff, and I'm going to buy a mansion off of this." It was all sounding too good to be true, but no one cared. It was working. It was real. And that's how I ended up spending all my spare time at the stock exchange, watching the shares of the Dutch East India Company skyrocket. But then, out of nowhere, another story started to grow. One that seemed to be growing even faster than the company. This one wasn't about ships or spices. It was about flowers. Yes, flowers. Specifically tulips. And I don't mean your average run-of-the-mill tulips. No, these were the rare, exotic kinds. The kind that seemed to have taken over the city. It all started with the Dutch elite as usual. They started paying crazy amounts of money for these rare tulip bulbs. I mean, they were literally trading them like they were gold. And at first I thought, okay, weird flex, but all right. But the crazy part? People started talking about it. Everywhere I went, I heard about these tulips. People were buying them like they were stocks. And suddenly, they weren't just for the rich anymore. No, people were lining up to get in on it. The market for tulip bulbs was growing and fast. Too fast. And here I was, just trying to get a piece of the Dutch East India Company's action. And now I was hearing talk about these flowers. Tulip Mania, they called it. Honestly, it sounded like a joke. I mean, it was flowers, right? But then one of my friends, a fellow merchant, came to me and said, "You should get in on the tulips. You can buy them now for a fraction of the price, and when the rare ones come in, you'll make a fortune." And so there I was. Tulips. Who would have thought? But there was a catch. People were buying these tulip bulbs not for what they were, but for what they might be worth. You see, it wasn't about growing them or planting them anymore. No, people were flipping tulips. They were trading them like stocks. At first I resisted. Tulips, really? I couldn't bring myself to invest in flowers. But then I started seeing people from all walks of life getting involved. Farmers, noblemen, bakers, and even fishermen. Everyone was buying and selling tulips. People were so into it that they were taking out loans just to buy bulbs. "It's a sure thing," they'd say, and honestly, I started to believe them. I got in. I bought a few bulbs here and there. Not much, just to test the waters. But I felt the excitement. People were paying outrageous amounts for tulips that didn't even exist yet. I thought to myself, how could I not? If the price kept going up, I could sell them and make a nice profit. It was simple math, right? Buy low, sell high. But as the weeks went on, the market for tulips became more and more volatile. Prices were climbing faster than anyone could keep up with, and everyone seemed to think they were getting in just before the bubble burst. But no one wanted to admit it. It was the perfect storm for a financial disaster. There were tulips changing hands faster than I could blink. People were making money off of nothing but speculation. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach, but everyone around me seemed so convinced it would never end. One day, I watched as a rare tulip bulb, one I'd only heard about in rumors, sold for the price of a small house. People were smiling, shaking hands and laughing. But as I watched the price rise, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. This wasn't right. I had seen how quickly money could disappear before, and I had seen bubbles burst, but I didn't act on it. Instead, I bought more. And more and more, just like everyone else. The days rolled by in a blur of excitement and rising prices. Everywhere I went, all I could hear were the words tulip bulb and trade. It was as if the entire city had been overtaken by this one thing, and the madness was spreading faster than I could keep up with. The whole market seemed to be dancing to the same tune, and I was no different. I kept buying bulbs, watching the prices go higher and telling myself it was just the natural course of things. But there were whispers. Whispers that I couldn't ignore. People were starting to sell their homes to buy more bulbs. It wasn't just the rich anymore. It was everyone. The tavern keeper had sold his tavern for a collection of rare tulip bulbs. My neighbor, who was a simple blacksmith, sold his forge for a few rare varieties. I couldn't understand it at first, but soon even I started thinking, why not? This is the greatest opportunity of my life. I was in deep. The market kept climbing, and I kept riding that wave. But as the weeks turned into months, I started to notice a few cracks. The prices seemed to climb with no logic behind them, just pure speculation. Tulips weren't really worth what people were paying for them. But who could stop it? It was a wave and everyone was riding it. The excitement in the streets was palpable. Even my wife, who had never cared about such things, would talk about the latest auction price over dinner. Then one fateful day, as I was sitting in the stock exchange, yes, I was trading tulips now. Like a full-fledged merchant, I heard a shout. At first I thought it was another round of excitement. But when I looked around, I saw that the mood had shifted. The same people who were laughing just a few hours ago now had their heads in their hands. The shouting wasn't excitement, it was panic. A man across the room was yelling something about how the market had collapsed. "The prices are falling," he cried. I stood up, my heart racing. How could this happen? The market had been so strong for so long. I rushed to the flower auction. The traders were still there, but now the energy felt different, tense, nervous. A bulb that had sold for 1,000 guilders was now barely worth 100. The auctioneer's voice, once smooth and confident, now wavered as bids came slower and slower. The tulip bubble was bursting, and no one seemed to be able to stop it. I tried to hold it together, but my stomach churned. I'd been caught up in this madness just like everyone else. I thought I was smart, playing the market like the professionals, but it felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, watching it crumble beneath me. The prices kept plummeting. I looked around, hoping for some sign that the market would stabilize, but it didn't come. Panic spread like wildfire. Traders were selling off their bulbs, trying to salvage whatever they could, but the tulip market had turned into a disaster. What was once a symbol of wealth and status had become a symbol of greed and foolishness. It was all falling apart, and I was right in the middle of it. I watched as my bulbs became worthless like so many other investments that had once seemed like a sure thing. I tried to hold on to ride it out, but it was impossible. No one was buying. I felt sick. I couldn't believe it. How had this happened? The market had been so strong, and now it was gone. Just like that, but it wasn't just me. I saw my neighbors, friends, and fellow traders, the ones who had once been so confident, so sure of their fortunes, now desperate, begging for a way out. There were those who had invested everything. They had mortgaged their houses, their land, their futures, all for a piece of a flower, and now it was worthless. I couldn't sleep for days. My thoughts were consumed by the collapse, by the ripple effect it was having on the rest of the economy. The tulip market was only a small part of the financial system, But the panic had spread beyond the flowers. People were afraid to invest in anything now, scared that it might collapse just as quickly. The banks were failing. I'd heard rumors of men losing their fortunes overnight. The financial ruin wasn't just happening in Amsterdam, it was affecting the entire country. The Dutch economy was spiraling, and we were all caught in its wake. I thought about my life before this. The way things used to be simple, the way I'd built my small business, the slow but steady progress I'd made. I had been content with that life. But the promise of wealth had lured me in, the thought of riches beyond my wildest dreams. The Dutch East India Company, the tulip bulbs. It all seemed so sure, so safe. But now I saw the truth. Greed, speculation, and the hope of easy money had led us all to disaster. It wasn't just the money I'd lost. It was the trust. The trust that had been built up over years. The belief in a system that seemed so stable, only to collapse under the weight of its own foolishness. The people I had once trusted, the people I had traded with, were now just as lost as I was. But amidst all the chaos, there was something else. Regret. Regret for not listening to those who had warned about the dangers of speculation. Regret for thinking I could outsmart the system. And regret for having been so blinded by the idea of wealth that I hadn't stopped to think about what was really at stake. The days after the collapse were a haze. There was no other word for it. The air in Amsterdam felt thick, heavy, like the weight of the entire city's shattered dreams hung in the air. The streets, once filled with the bustling energy of traders, now felt eerily quiet. The usual noise of lively bargaining had been replaced with hushed conversations and the occasional desperate shout. People had lost everything. The merchants, the common folk, even the once wealthy aristocrats, everyone was feeling the sting. And I was no different. I walked through the streets of Amsterdam, the familiar sights now foreign and unsettling. The houses, the shops, the markets, all empty, all abandoned. Some people had sold everything they had to buy tulip bulbs. They thought they were making a wise investment, securing their future. But now they had nothing, not even the things that once meant something. I ran into an old friend, Bartholomeus, who had been one of the first to invest in tulips. He was standing outside his shop, staring at the closed door as if waiting for something to happen. But nothing was happening. His shop was empty, and the windows, once filled with goods, were now bare. "How are you holding up, Peter?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as though the weight of the crash had already taken its toll on him. "I'm surviving," I replied, my own voice flat. "I've lost a bit, but nothing like some of the others." "What about you?" Bartholomeus let out a bitter laugh. "Lost everything. My savings, my business, my future. All of it gone." "For what?" "A flower. A damn flower." His anger was palpable, but there was also an overwhelming sadness behind it. We both knew the truth. This wasn't just about losing money. It was about trust. Trust in the market, in the system, in the people we had once relied on. And now that trust was gone. We were left with nothing but broken dreams and a city that no longer felt like home. "At least the tulips are still here," I said, gesturing to the small garden of wilted tulip bulbs outside his shop, the once precious flowers now useless. He looked at them for a long time, his eyes narrowing in contempt. "They're nothing now," he said. "Just bulbs. Nothing more than what they were when we first planted them. But we turned them into gods, didn't we? We worshipped them like they were the key to everything. And look what it got us." We both stood there for a moment, looking at the tulips. They seemed so innocent now. Just flowers like any others. But once upon a time they had been symbols of wealth, of success, of hope. And now they were just a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. I left Bartholomeus to his thoughts and wandered further into the city. The financial markets were in ruins. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange was barely open, and when it was, the atmosphere was nothing like it had been before. There was no energy, no excitement, just a cold, hard silence as people tried to figure out what had gone wrong and what to do next. I ran into another acquaintance, Willem, who had been involved in the tulip trade from the very beginning. He was standing near the exchange, watching as traders walked by, their faces grim. "Willem," I said, "how's everything? How do you think it's going?" He replied, his voice sharp. "It's a disaster, Peter. A complete disaster. I never thought it would happen like this, but here we are. The tulips were supposed to be our salvation, and now they're just a joke." He looked at the group of traders, many of whom were now reluctant to even look at each other. "I thought I had it figured out," Willem continued. "I thought this would be my ticket to the top. But the greed took over, and now look where we are." It was a familiar story. It was the same story everyone was telling. How they got caught up in the madness of speculation. How they thought the money would keep flowing. How they thought they could beat the system. But no one could. No one saw the end coming. "I'm done with it," Willem said, shaking his head. "Done with the tulips, done with the market. I'll find something else. There's no future here anymore." And there it was, the truth that no one wanted to admit. There was no future in the tulip market. There never had been. It had all been an illusion, and now the city had to rebuild from the ashes of that illusion. As I made my way back to my own modest home, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had settled in my chest. It wasn't just the money. It wasn't just the tulips. It was everything. The feeling of betrayal, of watching the whole system crumble under its own weight. There had been no real value to the tulips. No real value in any of it. It was all based on greed and speculation, and in the end it had cost us everything. I thought about the future. Would things ever get back to normal? Would people trust the market again? And what about the Dutch East India Company? It had been our cornerstone, our ticket to the world, but would the crash of the tulips affect it too? Or would it survive like it always had? The next few months were a blur of uncertainty. The tulip bubble had burst, but the damage it had done wasn't limited to just the tulip market. It had infected the whole economy. People didn't trust the stock exchange anymore. People didn't trust anything. The banks were failing, businesses were closing, and the streets of Amsterdam were filled with people trying to make sense of what had happened. I watched as the Dutch East India Company continued its trade, but even it wasn't untouched by the aftermath of the tulip crash. The VOC shares dropped in value, though not nearly as dramatically as the tulips had. It was a slow burn. Some people still believed in it, but many were afraid to invest, afraid to trust. And that was the most painful part of it all, losing trust. The crash wasn't just about losing money. It was about losing the faith that had built the market, the faith that allowed us to dream big and build something greater than ourselves. And now that faith had been shattered. As the city began to rebuild, I found myself thinking about the lessons learned from the tulip bubble. Speculation was dangerous. Greed was a poison. And trust, the most fragile of all, was something we couldn't take for granted. The story of the Tulip Mania would go down in history, a cautionary tale for future generations. But for us, the ones who lived through it, it was a painful reminder of the price we paid for our ambition. Months passed, and Amsterdam, like a city recovering from a storm, began to rebuild itself. But there was a certain quietness now, a sense of hesitation that hung in the air. People still went about their business, but it wasn't the same. The streets, once filled with the bustling energy of a thriving financial hub, now felt quieter. Fewer smiles, more whispers. It was like everyone was afraid to talk too loudly, afraid that any sound might bring the whole thing crashing down again. For the first time, I started to question the things I had always taken for granted. The rush of speculation, the drive to make money quickly, was it worth it? Was it worth losing everything, even your dignity, for a chance at wealth? One day I was walking through the same marketplace where just a year before tulip bulbs had been sold like the most precious jewels in the world. Now the flower stalls were quiet, and the tulips were just another flower, no different from the others. It was hard to look at them without feeling a little sick. They had been the symbol of our greed, the thing we thought would make us immortal. And now they were nothing more than flowers again. I ran into an old acquaintance of mine, Klaus. He was a fellow merchant who had been all in on the tulip trade just like me. But unlike me, he hadn't gotten out in time. His face looked older, weighed down by the kind of exhaustion that didn't come from hard work, but from the crushing weight of loss. "Peter," he said, his voice hollow. I should have listened. I should have known better. We stood there in silence for a while. There wasn't much to say anymore. The words "I told you so" didn't seem to matter. What mattered was what came next. What now? I asked him. Looking back now, I can't help but think that maybe the greatest gift we got from the tulip bubble wasn't the money we made, or lost, but the wisdom that came from the collapse. We learned that money, like everything else, has to be built on something real. If we remember that, We might just avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, and maybe, just maybe, we'll build something that lasts. Something that doesn't rely on the whims of speculation or the promises of easy wealth. Something that's built on trust, stability, and the understanding that real wealth comes from hard work and responsible choices. Maybe that's the real legacy of the tulip bubble, not the crash itself, but the lessons we learned from it. And those lessons, I believe, will last far longer than any flower ever could. The years after the tulip crash taught me something I never expected to learn: the value of patience. At first, I was desperate to recover my losses, to make up for all the mistakes I'd made in the heat of the moment. I wanted to jump back into the markets, throw myself into something else and make quick money, as though everything would be fine if I could just get ahead once more. But as the months turned into years, I realized that wasn't the way forward. Instead, I started focusing on rebuilding my life from the ground up, not rushing into anything. I began to understand that wealth wasn't something you could just gamble on and expect to last. It had to be earned slowly, carefully. The reckless days of speculation were behind me. The quick gains, the big promises, they all seemed so hollow now. What mattered was the steady growth, the long-term investments that actually had a foundation. I went back to the basics, starting small again. I invested in ships, in trade, in goods, things that I could see, touch, and understand. Sure, it wasn't as glamorous as flipping tulip bulbs or making a fortune on the stock exchange, but it was real. It was steady, and in that steadiness, I found a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. Some of the old traders who had survived the crash found themselves in the same position as me. They weren't jumping back into speculative markets either. Instead, they were investing in things that had true lasting value. Real assets like land and businesses, and slowly, over time, the markets began to stabilize. The Dutch East India Company, despite the setbacks, still had value. It wasn't the powerhouse it had once been, but it had weathered the storm. The same went for the economy. People started trusting the markets again, but with a new, cautious approach. The government, too, took steps to prevent another financial disaster. They introduced some basic regulations to control speculation, and though it was far from perfect, it was a step in the right direction. There were now rules to prevent the same kind of unchecked speculation that led to the tulip bubble. It was a relief, in a way, knowing that the wild days were over. The government seemed determined not to let the economy slip back into the same chaos. I'll admit, there was a part of me that was still a little bitter. I'd lost a lot, and I wasn't alone in that. People had lost everything. But as time passed, I began to feel something more than regret. I felt a quiet sort of pride. It was the pride of knowing that I had survived, that I hadn't given up, that I had learned from my mistakes and was rebuilding, piece by piece. And then one day, as I sat in my modest home, looking out at the city that had once been so full of promise and now seemed a little more grounded, I realized something important. The tulip bubble wasn't just a financial disaster. It was a lesson in greed, in excess, in the danger of thinking you can get rich without truly understanding the value of what you're investing in. It had taught us all that wealth wasn't just about fast gains, it was about sustainability. The truth was, I wasn't the only one who had learned this lesson. Everyone who had survived the crash had been forced to reckon with their own choices. We had all, in our own way, been part of the madness, and now we had to find a way to move forward. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. And maybe that was the true legacy of the tulip bubble. Not the wealth it promised, but the wisdom it left behind. I spent the rest of my days in Amsterdam, living a quieter life than I had before, focusing on steady investments and slow growth. I would occasionally meet up with old friends from the tulip days, and we'd talk about the old times, but it was different now. We weren't talking about the riches we once dreamed of. We were talking about the future, about what we could build now. We weren't chasing after something we couldn't have. Instead, we were building something that would last. The market, the city, even the world, it had all changed. And so had I. In the end, I realized that true wealth wasn't in the size of your fortune or the speed at which it grew. It was in the foundation you built it on. It was in the patience to watch something grow steadily, year after year. It was in the ability to learn from your mistakes and find a way forward, even when everything around you seemed to be falling apart. And if there's one thing I can say, It's that the lessons of the tulip bubble will stay with me for the rest of my life. We, the survivors, were lucky to learn them at all. It's funny how life seems to move on, even after something as big as the tulip crash. At first it felt like everything was on pause. The world had shifted so dramatically that it was hard to see what was ahead. But eventually people started picking up the pieces, even if it was a little slower than anyone would have liked. I remember walking down the streets of Amsterdam one morning, trying to get used to the quieter, more cautious rhythm of life. The stock exchange wasn't buzzing with the same energy it used to, but there was a sense of stability, a feeling that people were starting to get their feet back under them. The markets were still recovering, but I could see the signs of a slow recovery. Traders were making smarter, smaller moves. There was no rush, no wild speculation. In those quieter moments, I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't learned those lessons the hard way. Would the crash have come anyway? Or had the greed really blinded us to the inevitable? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for sure. Things had changed. The world of finance wasn't as carefree as it used to be. We had been shaken, and though it hurt, we were better for it. I found myself back in the shop, helping out more regularly now. My investments had been modest, and I didn't expect them to make me rich again, but at least I could live without constantly worrying about the next crash. I started focusing on long-term projects, businesses with actual value, things that weren't based on speculation. And slowly it felt like I was building something again. The Dutch East India Company still had a role to play in the economy, but it was different now. There was no more unchecked optimism about it. People were still trading its shares, but there were real questions being asked about its future. Would it continue to dominate the seas? Would it ever regain its former power? The company had been through its own rough patches during the tulip bubble, but it managed to weather the storm, like many of us had. It was scarred but still standing. As time went on, I started hearing about new ideas emerging from the government, ideas about creating a more stable financial system. They were talking about things like regulation, market oversight, and better ways to manage risk. The chaos of the past seemed to have sparked a desire for something more responsible, something that didn't rely on wild speculation. And I couldn't help but feel a little hopeful. Maybe the next generation of traders wouldn't make the same mistakes we had. Maybe they'd be smarter, more patient. In the years that followed, I watched as the financial system slowly grew more structured. The idea of stocks and bonds became more familiar, less like a gamble and more like a tool. The idea of investing, of making money over time rather than through quick wins, started to take root. The days of getting rich off a single tulip bulb were gone, and honestly, I was fine with that. Looking back, I realized that the real shift wasn't just in the financial system. It was in the way people saw wealth. We'd all been chasing after something shiny and new, hoping to make our fortune overnight. The crash had made us realize that real wealth, the kind that lasts, isn't found in speculation. It's found in patience, in understanding the value of what you have, and in building something that can weather storms. And when I look at Amsterdam today, I can see the difference. Sure, there are still traders, still markets, still people looking for their big break. But there's a sense of caution now. There's a sense of responsibility. People have learned to ask the hard questions before diving in, to think long-term instead of chasing the next quick fix. The mistakes of the past haven't been forgotten. They've been woven into the fabric of the future. I spent my last years quietly, passing on what I had learned to the younger traders who came to me for advice. They were eager, full of energy and hope, but they also listened. They didn't make the same mistakes I did. They were smarter. They knew better. And as I sit here now thinking about everything that happened, the rise, the crash, and the slow recovery, I realize something important. The tulip bubble wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a lesson. It was a warning. And though it cost us dearly, it was a lesson we needed to learn. Now I don't know. He looked at me, his eyes tired but still searching for some answer. I'm not sure how to rebuild. All I ever knew was how to make money quickly, how to take risks, and it all came crashing down. I don't even know where to start anymore. His words hit me harder than I expected. He was right. What now? What did we do after everything had fallen apart? The market had become a shadow of what it once was. The tulips were gone, and the Dutch East India Company, despite its early success, was no longer the golden goose. Sure, some people still invested in it, but there was no excitement left. The investors, like Klaus and me, had been burned by speculation, and now they were too cautious to go back in. I left Klaus there, standing by the empty tulip stalls, his mind still trapped in the past. I had my own regrets, but I didn't want to stay stuck in the same place. If I wanted to move forward, I had to find a way to rebuild too. The weeks after that were hard. I spent my time trying to salvage what little was left. My investments in tulips had been disastrous, but I still had some assets tied up in other ventures, albeit much smaller and more modest. I found work in a small trade shop, helping with the daily operations, though it wasn't much. It didn't matter, though. It was steady, and it kept my mind off the mess that was the crash. But what really stuck with me was how quickly things had turned. One moment we were all riding high on speculation, convinced that the sky was the limit. The next, we were all staring at the wreckage, wondering what went wrong. I had spent so much of my life chasing the dream of wealth, the illusion of easy money, and now I understood something. There's no such thing as easy money. If you build your wealth on sand, it doesn't matter how high you stack it, it's going to fall. In the months that followed, the economy began to stabilize. Slowly but surely, people started to rebuild. Some businesses bounced back, others didn't. It took a while, but people started to regain some trust in the markets, but not like before. The energy, the reckless optimism was gone. People had learned their lesson, hard as it was. I started to think about the future. The tulips were a thing of the past, and the Dutch East India Company still traded, but it wasn't the golden ticket everyone thought it was. It had been part of the bubble, after all. What would be next? Was there any way to make sure this didn't happen again? I began to hear rumors of a new system forming, something about regulation. People were talking about ways to make sure that the markets would be safer, that no one could just get swept away by the next sure thing. There were discussions of transparency and oversight in trading, of protecting the investors from the greed that had led us all astray. I didn't know much about it, but I was hopeful. Maybe the future of finance didn't have to be a gamble. Maybe it could be something more secure, something more stable. The way I saw it, if we were going to rebuild this city, we had to rebuild the trust that had been lost. We couldn't just go back to the way things were before. The world had changed, and we had to change with it. As I sat there thinking about it all, I realized that the tulip bubble wasn't just about the crash. It was about the lesson that we all learned too late. We had let our greed blind us. We had let speculation run wild without thinking about the consequences. And in the end, it was that greed that had taken everything we had worked for. But there was hope. If we could learn from our mistakes, if we could rebuild from the ground up with a more careful, responsible approach, maybe we could find our way back, and maybe, just maybe, we could avoid making the same mistakes again. It wasn't long before I began to see small shifts in the city. People were starting to come to terms with what had happened, though the scars of the Tulip Mania still lingered. The streets, once filled with the chatter of excited traders and the clink of coins, were quieter now. I could hear the hushed voices of those who had once been so eager to invest in everything, from tulips to ships, now speaking in cautious tones. People were wary. Investors were sitting on their hands, reluctant to trust anything again. But as the months passed, a new idea began to take shape. Slowly, the Dutch East India Company, despite its own struggles, was starting to show signs of stability. And more importantly, there were rumblings about reform. I overheard conversations about it in taverns and marketplaces. The word regulation whispered more and more often. People were starting to ask, how could we stop this from happening again? How could we prevent the next disaster? At first, I didn't know what to make of it. The word regulation didn't exactly sit well with me. I'd grown up in a world where the market was free, where the value of something was decided by its worth in the open market. But it was becoming clearer that we couldn't just keep trading like we had. The old system was broken. Something had to change. The Dutch government, for the first time, seemed willing to listen. There were talks about creating a system where stocks could be monitored, where the value of a company wasn't just based on speculation, but on actual worth. What a novel idea, right? I remember chuckling at first. How could they possibly regulate something as wild and unpredictable as the market? But then a strange thing happened. Slowly, people began to trust the market again. It wasn't immediate, of course. No one was rushing to buy shares in the Dutch East India Company like they had before, but there was a shift. There was an air of cautious optimism, a belief that maybe, just maybe, the next investment wouldn't crash and burn in the same way the tulip market had. I watched as new investors began to appear, this time with a different mindset. They weren't in it for the quick buck or the wild speculation. They were interested in steady growth, in real returns. It felt almost responsible. People were still eager to get involved in the markets, but now they were thinking long-term. It wasn't as exciting, but it was sustainable, and that felt better somehow. I met with a few of my old friends, the ones who had been through the crash with me. We gathered in a small pub, nursing our drinks and talking about how things had changed. We had all been burned by the tulip mania, but we hadn't given up. If anything, it had made us more cautious, more thoughtful about where we placed our trust. Bartholomeus, who had lost so much in the crash, was the first to speak. "You know, Peter," he said, swirling his drink, "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad it happened. Glad the bubble burst. Maybe it was the only way for us to realize just how dangerous all this speculation is. We thought we could get rich quick, but we forgot to ask, at what cost?" I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The crash had been painful, but it had taught us a lesson we wouldn't forget. The tulip mania had been a lesson in greed, but it had also been a lesson in the need for balance. There had to be a way to make money without losing sight of what mattered. I wasn't sure how to fix the system entirely, but I could see that things had to change. We couldn't go back to the wild days of unchecked speculation. It wasn't just about making money. It was about making money responsibly. Willem, who had also been deep in the tulip trade, looked thoughtful as he took a sip of his ale. "Maybe it's time we started investing in real things again," he said. "Tangible things, ships, goods, things that have real value. I mean, the Dutch East India Company is still in business, right? It's not all bad." It was a strange thought, but it felt right. Maybe the Dutch East India Company was our path forward, our opportunity to build a new kind of economy. One that wasn't just built on speculation and promises, but on real assets, real goods, real trade. As we continued to talk, a new idea began to form in my mind. What if the lessons we had learned from the tulip bubble could help shape the future of finance? What if we could create a market that wasn't just about getting rich quick, but about steady, responsible growth? What if we could rebuild Amsterdam's financial system, but this time with wisdom instead of greed? Of course, I didn't have all the answers. No one did. But I was starting to think that the future of Amsterdam, and maybe even the future of the world, wasn't going to be found in speculative bubbles or fleeting trends. It was going to be found in hard work, steady growth, and making investments in things that actually mattered. Over time, the Dutch East India Company did recover. It wasn't the same as before, but it was still there, still trading, still growing, just at a slower pace. People had learned to be more careful, to be more cautious in their investments. The tulip bubble had burst and the world had changed. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe we had learned something from the whole fiasco. Years passed, and while the tulip mania became a distant memory, the lessons it taught us stayed with me. Speculation could be dangerous. Greed could be deadly. And above all, the value of anything, whether it was a tulip, a share of stock, or even a ship, was only as real as the foundation it was built on. As I grew older, I found myself telling the younger generation the same story. The story of the tulip mania, the story of how we almost lost everything to our own greed, and the story of how we rebuilt. How we learned from the past and used those lessons to create a more stable future. In the end, the tulip bubble didn't just change the way we looked at finance. It changed the way we looked at life. We learned that you can't build a future on fleeting dreams, that you have to understand what you're investing in, whether it's a business, a home, or even a flower. And most importantly, we learned that wealth isn't just about getting rich. It's about being smart, being patient and building something real. I've seen many storms in my time, but I know this. The best thing we can do is learn from the past and keep moving forward. That's the only way we can avoid the same mistakes again. And as long as we remember that, we'll be all right. The years went on and the financial markets of Amsterdam slowly began to stabilize. The city was healing, but the scars of the tulip mania were still there, lingering in the corners of our minds. Every time someone mentioned investing, there was a pause, a hesitation. People were more cautious now, and rightly so. The wild days of speculation seemed like a distant memory, But the lessons learned were still fresh. I had my own small part to play in the recovery. Though my wealth had never been what it once was, I managed to hold on. My investments were smaller now, more careful. I stuck to trade, to things that made sense, things that had real value. No more chasing quick riches. No more dreams of getting rich off a flower. But as the city moved forward, I couldn't help but notice something else. The tulip bubble, as much as it had destroyed lives, had also opened our eyes to something important. It had exposed the dangers of unchecked greed, the fragility of systems built on nothing but speculation. And it had sparked a desire for change, a push for something more stable, more secure. It was like a wake-up call for everyone involved in trade and finance. We couldn't go back to the way things were. The crash had forced us to confront the realities of the financial world, and there was no going back. The Dutch East India Company, despite the rough patch it had gone through during the tulip crisis, managed to survive. It was never quite the same, though. There was no longer the same blind faith in its success. People had learned that even the most established company could falter. But that didn't mean it was useless. Far from it. The VOC still played a huge role in global trade, and it still made a lot of people rich, though now the investors were more cautious, more aware of the risks. I met with an old friend, Lucas, who had also been caught up in the tulip madness. He had lost nearly everything. At first he was bitter, but time had changed him. As we sat together sharing a drink, he said something that stuck with me. "You know, Peter," he began, his voice rough from years of disappointment, "I used to think wealth was the goal, that the more you had, the better your life would be. But now, after all of this, I see things differently. The real wealth isn't in money. It's in stability. It's in knowing what you're investing in making sure you're not just chasing empty promises." I nodded. He was right. The way we had all chased after quick wealth without thinking about the consequences had led to nothing but disaster. But now, in the aftermath, we were all trying to rebuild, not just our fortunes, but our understanding of what truly mattered. I had seen it firsthand, the devastation, the fear, the anger. But now, looking at Amsterdam, I saw something else. I saw people learning, people rebuilding, not just financially, but emotionally. The trust in the market, while still fragile, was starting to come back, but it was different now. It wasn't based on speculation. It wasn't based on the false hope of riches in a single moment. It was built on something real, on businesses that had value, on ships that brought goods and not just promises. People had learned that trust had to be earned, not just given. And as the years went on, I saw the rise of a new financial landscape. The VOC and the economy were more regulated now, more structured. There was more oversight, more care taken in the way markets were run. The lessons we had learned from the tulip bubble weren't forgotten. They were used to build something better, something more secure. I spent my last years quietly, doing the work I knew best. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. The money I made was steady, not flashy. And that was fine with me. It wasn't about getting rich anymore. It was about finding peace. I had my small share of peace even after all the madness. And every now and then when I walked through the streets of Amsterdam, I'd think about the past, the rise and fall of the tulips, the greed that had consumed us all, and the lessons we had learned. In the end, it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the knowledge. The understanding that wealth, real wealth, isn't about chasing after fleeting trends. It's about building something that lasts. It's about taking care with your choices and having the patience to see them grow over time. And that's what I hope the next generation will remember. The story of the tulip bubble isn't just a story of financial disaster. It's a story of growth, both in the economy and in ourselves. A story of learning from our mistakes and making sure we don't repeat them, because in the end, that's how we move forward. We learn, we adapt, and we build. It's been years since the bubble burst, but even now, every time I pass through the heart of Amsterdam, I can't help but remember the way the city used to feel, alive with the sound of ambition, filled with the promise of easy riches. Now there's a quiet calm to the city. People go about their business with a kind of cautious optimism, like they've learned their lesson the hard way. The markets have started to hum again, but with a new rhythm, a new understanding. I suppose that's the strange thing about time. It has a way of erasing the sharp edges of pain, turning it into something more manageable. You see it everywhere now, in the faces of the traders who once sat on the floor of the exchange with eyes wide and hearts full of greed. Now they sit a little quieter, a little more reflective. No one is shouting, no one is gambling. The lessons we learned during the tulip bubble have made their mark on all of us. But there's something else I've noticed. While the financial markets have stabilized and the chaos of the tulip mania has become a distant memory, the world of finance is still just as unpredictable. Sure, we've put systems in place, created regulations, and tried to prevent history from repeating itself. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that human nature hasn't changed all that much. The drive for wealth, the urge to get rich quick, it's still there lurking under the surface. And as long as that's the case, the potential for another bubble will always be there too. I think about the tulips sometimes, not with anger or regret, but with a kind of strange fondness. It sounds silly, but they were a symbol of our ambition, our desires, and our flaws. The tulips were never really about the flowers. They were about the dream we all shared. The idea that anyone, no matter their status or background, could make it big with just a little luck. It wasn't the tulips that had value, but the hope they represented. The funny thing is, in the aftermath of it all, I've come to understand something important. The tulips didn't ruin us. It was the way we let them control us, the way we let our greed take over that caused the destruction. The flower itself was just a catalyst, a mirror reflecting our own desires. And in the end, we were the ones who fell. But time has a way of healing wounds, and Amsterdam, for all its scars, has continued on. It has rebuilt itself, as have we all. The world didn't end with the crash. It went on, and so did we. We learned, and as painful as the lessons were, they were worth it. Because now there's a certain wisdom that runs through the city's streets. People are still ambitious, but they're more thoughtful about it. They know that real wealth comes from something more lasting, something built on patience, responsibility, and a little bit of humility. I don't know what the future holds. I can't predict whether the next big bubble is just around the corner or whether we've learned enough to avoid it. But one thing's for certain. We've been through something that changed the way we look at wealth, at success, and at the markets. And that's something worth remembering. Maybe in the end, the most important lesson we learned wasn't about money at all. It was about understanding that wealth, in all its forms, is fragile, that it can vanish just as quickly as it appears. But the things that truly matter, patience, trust, and hard work, those things endure. I hope the next generation takes that to heart. I hope they learn from our mistakes, just as we've tried to learn from the tulip bubble. The world of finance will always be unpredictable, but if we can remember the lessons of the past, we might just be able to navigate it a little more wisely. As I sit here now, reflecting on all that's happened, I realize that the tulip bubble wasn't just about a flower. It was about the human condition, about greed, about ambition, about the way we chase after things we think will make us happy. And it's also about the realization that happiness doesn't come from getting rich quick. It comes from living wisely, from making decisions that stand the test of time. I don't regret everything I've been through. Sure, I lost money. I lost opportunities. But what I gained in return was something far more valuable, a lesson I'll never forget. And if I can pass that lesson on to someone else, maybe the next big bubble won't burst quite as violently. As the years passed, I often found myself walking the same streets I had once walked during the height of the tulip mania. But now, the energy of the city felt different. It wasn't the frantic pace of speculation and dreams of wealth that had once consumed Amsterdam. No, now the city had an air of quiet resilience. There was an understanding, a collective wisdom that had settled in, though it was hard-won. People were still trading, still building businesses, but there was a certain level of caution, a level-headedness that hadn't been there before. We had learned our lesson the hard way, but that was the thing about lessons. Sometimes they stick. I spent my days thinking about those lessons, about the things we had lost and the things we had gained. The tulips were no longer the centerpiece of conversation. No one dared to even speak of them in public anymore. They had become a symbol of our folly, a reminder of a time when our greed had overshadowed our common sense. But there was something else I started to notice. People had started to look at things differently. Sure, they still wanted to make money, still wanted to build wealth, but they were more thoughtful about it. They wanted to invest in things that had actual value. Things that weren't just a gamble. I remember meeting up with some old friends at the market. There was a new energy in the air, but it wasn't like before. It wasn't the excitement of getting rich overnight. It was a quieter energy, the kind that comes from building something sustainable. We weren't talking about tulip bulbs this time. We were talking about trade, about real goods, spices, timber, ships, the kind of things that could be touched, seen and used. Things that had intrinsic value. I found it oddly comforting. In some ways it felt like we were starting over, but this time we were doing it the right way. One of my old acquaintances, Hendrik, who had also been burned by the tulip bubble, approached me one afternoon with a proposal. He'd spent the last few years working on a new venture, a business that focused on shipping real goods, things people actually needed, like salt and spices. "Peter," he said, "I've been thinking about it. The world's changing. We don't need to chase after the quick profits anymore. Let's focus on things that have real, lasting value." I could see the sincerity in his eyes. This wasn't the same Hendrik who had jumped into the tulip trade without a second thought. This was a man who had learned from the past, who knew that wealth didn't come from speculation. It came from building something with your hands, something solid, something reliable. "I think you're right," I said, nodding slowly. "We've all been through too much to go back to that madness. Let's do it the right way, Hendrik." And so that was the start of a new chapter. We began investing in ships, in goods that could be traded across seas, things that could be sold and used. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't quick money, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was doing something that made sense. There was no thrill in it, no wild ride, but there was something better: stability. We started small, but we worked steadily, built relationships, and over time things started to grow. The new way of thinking had taken root. It wasn't just us. Over the next few years, I saw the same shift in others. The markets weren't about gambling anymore. People were more thoughtful, more calculated. There was a sense of responsibility in the air. Businesses grew slowly but steadily, and the economy began to regain its balance. It was clear that we had learned the lesson of the tulip bubble, not just about the risks of speculation, but about what it means to build something that lasts. The government had also begun to take action. They introduced new rules to keep the market stable, to prevent the kind of unchecked speculation that had brought us to our knees. There were new regulations for trade, new systems of oversight for stock exchanges, and for the first time there was a sense that we weren't just left to our own devices. People started to feel safer. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And through it all, Amsterdam began to feel like a city that had finally found its footing again. The past was still there, in the cracks of the buildings, in the quiet reminders of the tulip mania that had once consumed us. But those cracks were healing, and they were part of the city's story now. We had been through the fire, and we had come out the other side, wiser, more cautious, and maybe, just maybe, a little more humble. I spent my later years in relative peace, reflecting on everything that had happened. The world had moved on, and so had I. I had made my peace with the past, with the mistakes I had made and with the losses I had suffered. The tulip bubble had been a painful chapter in Amsterdam's history, but it was a chapter that had taught us something valuable. It had shown us the dangers of unchecked greed and the importance of building with purpose, not just for the sake of wealth, but for the sake of the future. As I sat by the fire, looking out over the city that had been both the stage and the victim of so much ambition, I couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the lessons learned, for the strength we had found in rebuilding, and for the understanding that wealth is not just something you chase, it's something you earn, slowly and carefully over time. The tulips are gone now, their petals long faded, but their lesson lives on. The world may change, the markets may rise and fall, but the value of patience, hard work, and responsibility remains. And that, I think, is something that will last longer than any bubble ever could. Years have passed since the tulip bubble burst, and Amsterdam has come to a sort of quiet peace. But if I'm honest, I'll say that even after all this time, the lessons of that madness haven't fully left me. I still catch myself sometimes thinking about how everything felt before the crash, the rush, the excitement, the belief that we could all get rich without having to work for it. But now I see the world differently. I see it through the lens of what happened, the consequences of our collective greed. And it's hard to forget. Even now, the city is rebuilding, though in ways I never imagined. It's not the same Amsterdam as it once was. Gone are the days of wild speculation. Gone are the frantic discussions about how much a tulip bulb could sell for. Now, when I walk through the streets, it feels steadier, like the foundation has been laid on solid ground. The air is quieter, But in a way it's better. There's no longer the constant tension that used to hang over everything. No longer the feeling that we were all just one bad move away from losing everything. I see younger traders now, the next generation, and they seem so different from us. They're careful, thoughtful, they're asking questions, questioning everything before they act. They understand the value of things before they invest in them. It's like they know deep down that wealth isn't something you can just grab with both hands. They've learned the hard way from the mistakes of those who came before them, and I think that's a good thing. I've spent some of my later years mentoring some of these younger traders, trying to pass on the wisdom I've gathered over the years. Not that I know everything, but I've learned a few things the hard way. I tell them that it's okay to take risks, but only the right kind of risks. I tell them that there's no shame in being patient, in waiting for something that lasts. I tell them to look for value, not for fleeting trends. Because what happened during the Tulip Mania, what we all went through, was a crash that left scars not just on the economy, but on the people who lived through it. And I think if I can pass on anything to the next generation, it's the importance of building wealth slowly, steadily. And of course, there's still the occasional person who will bring up the tulips, either in jest or as a reminder of how far we've come. The younger folks hear the story and laugh, not really understanding the weight of it all. They don't know what it was like to live through the chaos, to feel the ground slip out from under you as the entire economy crashed. But I suppose that's the point. The next generation shouldn't have to understand. They shouldn't have to live through the same mistakes. But sometimes when I'm walking along the canals, watching the boats pass by and the sun reflect off the water, I think about the tulips. I think about the madness, the money, the lives ruined. And then I think about how everything changed after that. How in the end the crash taught us something, though it took a long time to learn. Maybe that's the true legacy of the tulips. Not the flowers themselves, but what they taught us about greed, about the fragility of wealth, and about how easily we can lose everything if we don't build on something real. I guess that's the thing about time. It moves on and we move with it. Things change, but the lessons? Those stay with you. Even now, as I watch the world slowly move forward, I know that what we went through wasn't just a moment of madness. It was a lesson, etched into the very fabric of the city. And for all the pain and loss, maybe that's the only thing we can hold on to. The tulips are gone. The market has changed, but the lesson remains. And as long as that lesson stays with us, maybe we won't make the same mistake again. The years after the tulip bubble burst have been long, but they've also been filled with a strange sense of peace. Amsterdam has slowly rebuilt itself, not just in terms of its economy, but in the hearts of its people. The tulip crash, as painful as it was, taught us something we couldn't ignore. It took a toll on the city, on businesses, on families, but in a strange way it also united us. We had been humbled. The mad rush for quick wealth was gone, replaced by a more cautious, thoughtful approach to trade and finance. I can't help but notice how different things are now, especially in the markets. When I look at the younger traders today, I see a level of caution, of deliberation, that was never there in our time. When I was their age, I would have rushed into any opportunity without thinking twice. But they ask questions. They think about what they're investing in, not just what they could make from it. They've learned the lessons of the past, even if they don't know it yet. It's a relief in a way. Maybe we didn't get everything wrong. I think about my time during the bubble, about how much of it felt like a fever dream. The madness of it all, the way we all convinced ourselves that tulips were the key to eternal wealth. I can still remember the energy of those days, the excitement, the possibility. It felt like we were on the verge of something massive, something that could change everything. But we were also on the edge of a cliff and none of us saw it. When it all came crashing down, it felt like the earth itself had cracked open. People were devastated, their lives turned upside down. And for what? A flower that didn't mean anything, not really. But I don't think we can blame the tulips. They were just the catalyst. The truth is, it was our own greed that led us to disaster. The belief that we could get rich without really working for it, without considering the consequences. And it wasn't just about money. It was about something deeper. It was about trust. Trust in the system, trust in each other, and most of all, trust in our own ability to control something as wild as the market. That trust was shattered, and it took a long time to rebuild. Still, I can't say I regret everything. The crash was terrible, no doubt, but it taught me something about what really matters in life. It wasn't the quick wealth or the instant success that brought fulfillment. It was the slow, steady growth, the kind of growth that comes from hard work, from investing in something that lasts, from building something you can stand on. That's the kind of wealth that's real. I've spent the years since then working with others who felt the same way. There's a small group of us now, working together on projects that are built on trust, on stability. We're not chasing after the next big thing, the next sure bet. Instead, we're looking for investments that will last, businesses, goods, ideas that have real value. No more gambling. No more wild speculation. It's about building something solid, something that can weather any storm. I know it's a long road ahead. The markets will never be perfect. There will always be risks, always opportunities to make a quick profit, to fall back into old habits. But now when I see the younger generation coming up, I see hope. I see a future where people are taking their time, considering their options, and making decisions with care. In the end, that's what I hope we've all learned from the tulip bubble. It's not just about making money. It's about making money wisely. It's about knowing what you're investing in, understanding the value of what you hold in your hands, and building something that stands the test of time. The tulips are gone, but the lesson remains. And if we remember that lesson, we might just avoid making the same mistakes again. So here's to the future, to careful investments, to slow and steady growth, and to a financial system that values sustainability over speculation. It won't be easy, but it will be real. And that's all any of us can ask for. The years continued to unfold, and with them came a quieter, more thoughtful rhythm in Amsterdam. The stock exchange still buzzed, but not with the frenzied energy it once had. The panic and wild speculation of the past had settled into something more grounded, something that felt more real. I often found myself walking through the streets, reflecting on the past, thinking about how the city had changed, and how, in many ways, we had changed with it. The younger traders, those who had entered the market after the crash, seemed different from us. They didn't have the same urgency in their eyes, the same hunger for quick success. They were more careful, more deliberate. They had inherited the lessons of the tulip bubble, even though they hadn't lived through it. It was in the way they talked about investments, the way they asked questions, the way they thought about the future rather than the now. It wasn't that they lacked ambition. No, they still dreamed big, but they understood that it took time. They understood that wealth didn't come from chasing after fleeting trends. It came from building something sustainable, something that would last. It was a relief to see, honestly. They were the future of this city, and for the first time in a long time I felt hopeful about it. I spent my days mostly working with these younger traders. Not in the same way I had worked with the tulip bubble, where we had been blinded by the hope of riches. Now we worked together to create something solid, investments that made sense, businesses that had real value. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't exciting, but it was steady. And in a way, that steadiness felt like a victory after everything that had happened. There were still people, of course, who looked back at the tulips with nostalgia. They missed the excitement, the rush of speculation, the feeling that anything could happen. But those people were fewer now. The city had learned. We had all learned in our own way, and while some might still chase the high of quick riches, most of us were more cautious, more thoughtful. We understood that wealth was something you built, not something you hoped to win. It's strange, but I look back at the Tulip Mania without anger. Maybe a little regret, sure, but not anger. Because in the end, it taught us something we needed to learn. It showed us the dangers of greed, the fragility of unchecked ambition, and it showed us the value of patience, of slow growth, and of making decisions with a clear head. I don't know what the future holds. The world keeps moving, the markets keep changing, and I can't predict what will come next. But what I do know is this. The mistakes we made, the lessons we learned, they're not just part of Amsterdam's history. They're part of who we are now. And if we remember that, if we continue to build on the lessons of the past, then maybe we won't fall into the same traps again. Maybe we'll make the next generation's story a little bit better. The tulips are gone now, and their legacy remains, not in the flowers, but in the lessons we learned from them. The financial world will never be free of risks, of speculation. But as long as we hold on to the wisdom that came from that painful time, I believe we can build something more lasting, something more sustainable. The future is uncertain, but as long as we remember the past, I think we'll be okay. As I sit here years after the Tulip Mania, I can't help but reflect on everything that's happened. The city has changed, sure, but so have I. The recklessness of my youth, the excitement of chasing after quick riches, all of that feels like a lifetime ago now. But that's the thing about time. It has a way of putting things into perspective, doesn't it? The streets of Amsterdam still hum with life, though it's different now. The rush of speculation has faded, replaced by something more steady, more deliberate. The stock exchanges are still alive with trading, but it's no longer the chaotic frenzy it once was. People are making money, yes, but they're doing it cautiously, responsibly. And while the memories of the tulip bubble still linger, there's a sense that we've learned from them. I think about the younger traders I see now. When I was their age, I was so caught up in the dream of getting rich quickly, of seizing the opportunity before anyone else could. But now, they're more thoughtful. They ask questions. They do their research. They take their time. And maybe that's the difference. They've seen what happens when you don't take your time, when you let greed take over. They've learned from the mistakes of those who came before them. It's not all perfect, of course. There are still people who get caught up in the allure of quick money. The ones who want to believe that wealth can come easily, but they're fewer now. Most people, I think, are more cautious. They've learned that the best way to build something lasting is through patience and hard work. And that's a shift, isn't it? I've spent a lot of time reflecting on my own role in all of this. The tulip bubble was a moment of madness, but it wasn't just about the tulips. It was about us, the people who got swept up in it, who believed that wealth could come from anything, from something as simple as a flower. We were looking for something quick, something that would change our lives in an instant. And we found it. But we also found the consequences. Looking back, I think that's the true lesson of the tulip bubble. Not just about speculation, but about the dangers of chasing something you don't fully understand. We were all looking for a shortcut to success, but there is no shortcut. There's no quick way to lasting wealth. It takes time. It takes effort. It takes knowledge. And if you're not careful, you can lose it all just as quickly as you gained it. And yet, I don't think the tulip bubble was a total loss. Yes, it cost us a lot. Yes, it ruined lives and shattered dreams. But it also taught us something. It taught us that wealth is not something you gamble on. It's something you build. And while it took a financial disaster to make that clear, I think we've all come out of it a little wiser. I'll admit, sometimes I miss the old days, the excitement, the thrill of watching prices rise, the sense that anything could happen. But now as I sit here, I realize something. The thrill of it all was an illusion. The real value isn't in the rise of prices, the quick gains, or the promises of easy money. The real value is in the foundation, the slow, steady work that goes into building something that lasts. And that's what I hope the next generation understands. They'll still face challenges, still encounter temptation, still have moments where the easy way seems the best way. But if they remember the lessons of the tulip bubble, if they take the time to build something real, then maybe they won't have to learn the hard way as we did. The tulips are gone, but the lessons remain. And maybe that's the most valuable thing we can take away from it all. Not the money, not the glory, but the understanding that true wealth isn't about chasing fleeting dreams. It's about building something that stands the test of time. The years continued to pass, and Amsterdam's financial landscape shifted into something more stable, though never quite the same as before. The scars from the tulip bubble remained, not just in the economy, but in the hearts of those who had lived through it. But the city had a way of recovering, of rebuilding itself from the ashes of its own mistakes. People didn't forget, but they adapted. They learned. I've watched this slow process, seen how the younger generations approach business and trade, with a kind of quiet confidence that wasn't there when I was their age. It's as though they've been handed a manual on what not to do, and they're using it. They're more cautious, more thoughtful, more methodical. And honestly, that's been one of the more reassuring things to witness, knowing that the lessons we learned in the hardest possible way are being passed on. Of course, the road to this point wasn't without its bumps. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the market looked like it might take another dangerous turn, but the fear wasn't as pervasive. The wild speculation had been replaced by a more grounded approach, a more steady hand in the markets. The mistakes of the past had left their mark, and the city moved forward, knowing it had to do so carefully. The Dutch East India Company, though it had suffered from the aftermath of the tulip crash, was still operating, still trading, still providing. Its role in global trade was important, though it was no longer the get-rich-quick scheme that it had once been for so many. People still trusted it, but with a healthy wariness. They understood now that no investment was without risk, and that the true value of something, whether a company or a commodity, was found in what it offered, not in how quickly you could sell it. The tulips, however, were gone. The market had dried up, and the tulips had become little more than a memory. People still grew them, of course, and they still admired their beauty, but they no longer represented wealth, at least not in the same way. Instead, they had become a symbol of a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when ambition outpaces reason. And as for me, well, I kept working, kept living, and kept learning. I still had my small investments, nothing flashy, nothing that would turn me into a fortune overnight, but they were steady and they were real. I'd learned the value of slow, sustainable growth, of putting in the effort and waiting for the reward. And as I grew older, I realized that was enough. I didn't need the wild highs and the crashing lows. I needed stability. I needed peace of mind. And in a way I found it. It wasn't the wealth I'd once dreamed of, but it was something more lasting. I had my small successes, my little wins. I had my family, my health, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd built something that would last, something that wasn't based on the flimsy promises of quick wealth. Looking around at the younger traders today, I can't help but feel a bit of pride. They've come into a world where they don't have to learn the hard way. They have the benefit of hindsight, the benefit of our mistakes. They're not rushing for the same fleeting riches that we once sought. They're taking their time, building on solid foundations and understanding that real wealth comes from hard work, not luck. The tulips may be gone, but the lessons of the tulip bubble will last far longer than any flower ever could. They're woven into the very fabric of the city now, and they've shaped the way we all think about money, about business, about success. We've learned to be cautious, to be thoughtful, to build slowly, and to make sure that whatever we invest in has real value. So, as I sit here in the quiet of my home, looking out at the city that has come so far from the chaos of the past, I can't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the lessons we learned, hard as they were. Grateful for the stability we've found, even if it came at the cost of our illusions. I don't know what the future holds, but I do know this. The world of finance is always going to be unpredictable. There will always be risks, always be opportunities to make a quick profit. But as long as we remember the mistakes of the past, remember the tulip bubble, we might just avoid repeating them. And maybe, just maybe, we'll build something that lasts. Something that won't crash as easily as a flower. The tulips may be gone, but their legacy lives on in all of us. The years after the crash were quieter, but in a way, they were also more fulfilling. The world had moved on, as it always does, but I had found peace in a new, slower pace. Amsterdam had been shaken to its core by the tulip bubble, but slowly, surely it began to recover. People adapted, learned from the chaos, and built a foundation that was more stable, more thoughtful than before. The wild energy of the tulip market faded into a lesson for the ages. I kept to my work. Small ventures, steady investments, things that could grow slowly and steadily without the reckless swings of the past. The days of risking it all on a single flower were long gone, but in their place was something even more valuable: security. Not just financial security, but peace of mind. As I worked, I kept seeing the younger generation of traders, the ones who had not been caught up in the madness. They were thoughtful, measured. They spoke less of riches and more of sustainability, of growing businesses and working together. Their approach to the market was grounded. It felt in many ways like the city had learned how to move forward, how to build something lasting instead of chasing after fleeting fantasies. It wasn't about getting rich fast. It was about getting rich slowly, steadily, with careful hands. I spent time with some of these younger traders. They wanted to hear the story of the tulip bubble, and I told them, though I didn't tell it as a tale of loss. I told it as a tale of lessons learned, lessons that should never be forgotten. They listened intently, knowing full well that they were inheriting the legacy of our mistakes. They seemed determined not to repeat it, and in that I found hope for the future. And even with all the steady work, the slow growth, I still found myself looking back every so often. The tulip bubble hadn't just been a financial disaster. It had been a moment of madness that had shown us just how quickly things could go wrong. But it had also shown us how resilient we could be. People didn't just lose their money and disappear. They rebuilt. They found new ways to work, new paths forward. And I think that's what the tulip bubble had ultimately taught us. That wealth isn't everything. What matters is the ability to bounce back, to learn from the mistakes, and to move forward with the understanding that nothing lasts forever. There were still echoes of that time, whispers in the markets, people who would look at a tulip bulb and remember what had happened. But it wasn't fear that lingered. It was wisdom, a cautious understanding of just how fragile everything could be. I've spent my final years in a quiet corner of Amsterdam, watching as the world continues to move, as businesses grow and fall, as markets fluctuate. But I no longer feel that rush I once felt. I no longer long for the big payoff, the quick win. I've learned to appreciate the small things, the slow, steady rise of a good investment, the quiet satisfaction that comes from making decisions that won't just last a year, but will endure for decades. The tulips are long gone, and their bubble has burst into history, but the lessons they taught us will stay with us forever. If we remember to build slowly, to think carefully, to avoid the temptations of fleeting wealth, we can ensure that the next generation doesn't make the same mistakes. So as I look out over this city, over the streets that have seen so much, I can't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. Amsterdam is still standing, the market is still moving, and we've learned something important along the way. In the end, it wasn't the tulips that were important, it was what we learned from them, and that's the real treasure. As time passed, I started to realize that the lessons of the tulip bubble were woven into the very fabric of my being. I wasn't the same person I had been back when the city was brimming with excitement and the promise of quick wealth. Those days of feverish speculation, of chasing after something that seemed so certain but was so fragile, were behind me. They had to be. I had learned the hard way that the kind of wealth we had sought wasn't worth the cost. Amsterdam too had changed. It had healed slowly but surely from the scars of the Tulip Mania. The market still buzzed with activity, but there was a new tone now, one that was far more cautious, more deliberate. The once frantic energy had faded into something quieter, more thoughtful. The wild optimism had been replaced by a sense of careful optimism. People were still trading, still making money, but there was a new respect for the process, a new understanding that wealth doesn't come overnight. I had my small part in all of this. I didn't become a wealthy man again, not in the way I once imagined, but that wasn't what mattered anymore. What mattered was that I had found a new path, one that was grounded in reality, not in dreams of instant success. I focused on small businesses, on steady investments that had real, lasting value. I didn't need to get rich quick. I needed to get rich in a way that made sense, in a way that could endure. I'd look back at the younger traders now and see the same spark in their eyes that I once had. But now that spark was tempered with a deeper understanding. They were building something real, not chasing after illusions. They were part of a new generation, one that had been shaped by the mistakes of those who had come before them. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, knowing that the lessons we had learned would live on through them. When I walked through the streets of Amsterdam, I would often pass the old flower markets, where the tulips had once been sold for ridiculous sums. It was strange to see the flowers now. Just flowers, nothing more. People walked past them without a second glance, and it made me wonder how many of them even remembered what those bulbs had once symbolized. I didn't mind that they had been forgotten. The tulips were a symbol of a time when ambition had overshadowed common sense, a time that we had left behind. The city had moved on, and so had I. The mistakes of the past were no longer a weight on my shoulders. Instead, they had become part of the story that I carried with me, a story of how greed had led us astray and how patience and wisdom had brought us back. There would always be risks in life, but we had learned how to manage them. We had learned how to make decisions with care, with consideration for what truly mattered, and as I sit here looking out over the city, I realize that the greatest gift the Tulip Mania gave us wasn't the wealth it promised, but the understanding that wealth, when it's built on a foundation of patience and responsibility, is the only kind that lasts. The tulips may be gone, but their legacy lives on. It lives on in the way we approach the market, in the way we make decisions, in the way we build for the future instead of chasing after the fleeting highs of easy money. And that, I think, is what truly matters. As I sit here reflecting on everything that has passed, I can't help but feel a certain peace. For it's been years since the madness of the tulip bubble, and though the memories of those days still linger, they've become something different now. They've become a part of the story of Amsterdam, a reminder of our mistakes, yes, but also of our resilience. We've rebuilt not just the city, but ourselves. The crash, as painful as it was, showed us just how fragile things could be. But it also showed us how strong we could be in the face of adversity. The city feels different now. The wild speculation, the chase for quick wealth, it's gone. The markets still exist, of course, but there's a new understanding in the air. People are more cautious now, more thoughtful. The lessons of the Tulip Mania are still fresh in our minds, and they've shaped the way we approach business, trade, and finance. We've learned that wealth doesn't come from getting rich quick. It comes from building something solid, from understanding the true value of what you have, and from working steadily toward your goals. I walk through the streets of Amsterdam now, and while the scars of the past are still there, they no longer feel like a burden. The city has moved on, and so have I. I see the younger generation, traders, business owners, investors, and I can't help but feel hopeful. They're more cautious, yes, but they're also smarter. They're building for the long term, not chasing after fleeting gains. And in that I see the future of this city. I've had my share of regrets, of course. I still think about the tulip bubble sometimes, about how it all spiraled out of control. But I also think about what came after. I think about the wisdom we gained, the way we rebuilt from the wreckage. It wasn't easy and it took time, but we did it. And as I get older, I realize that it's not the mistakes that define us. It's how we learn from them, how we grow in their shadow. I've spent these last years in a quiet corner of the city, living a modest life, finding peace in the steadiness that once felt so boring. I don't need the excitement of a booming market or the thrill of watching prices rise. What I need is something real, something that lasts. And in that, I've found contentment. I've built something small but solid. It may not have made me a fortune, but it's made me feel like I'm contributing to something more lasting than the fleeting wealth we once sought. And as for the tulips, well, they've become just flowers again. People still grow them, still admire them for their beauty, but no one sees them as a symbol of wealth anymore. They've lost their power, but in a way I think that's a good thing. They were never meant to be symbols of fortune. They were just flowers. The real wealth was always in the lessons we learned, the ones we carry with us now, the ones that guide us as we move forward. I suppose, when all is said and done, the tulip bubble wasn't just about the money we lost. It was about the way we looked at the world, the way we thought about success, and how we were willing to throw everything away in pursuit of something that didn't really exist. And in the end, that's what I've come to understand. True success doesn't come from fleeting wealth. It comes from building something real, something that stands the test of time. As I look out over Amsterdam today, I see a city that's wiser, more grounded. It's been through a lot, but it's still here. And so am I. We've learned the hard way, but we've learned all the same. The tulips may be gone, but the lessons we took from them are still with us. And that's the greatest wealth we could ever have. It's funny how the years go by, isn't it? Time has a way of softening even the hardest memories. The days after the tulip bubble burst felt like a slow-motion disaster. It was like watching the world you knew collapse in front of you, and there was nothing you could do to stop it. People lost their fortunes, their homes, their livelihoods, all for a gamble that, in hindsight, seemed so obvious. Yet when you're in the middle of it, when you're swept up in the excitement, it's hard to see it coming. But now, looking back, I can't help but feel a sense of gratitude for what happened. It sounds strange, doesn't it? To be thankful for something that caused so much pain. But if I hadn't experienced it, if I hadn't learned those painful lessons, I wouldn't be the person I am today. I wouldn't have understood what true wealth means. Not the kind you can buy with gold or with tulip bulbs, but the kind that comes from patience, from building something that lasts. Amsterdam has come a long way since those days. The city feels different now, more measured, more grounded. People are still ambitious, still eager to build and grow, but there's a new respect for the process. No one talks about tulips in the same way anymore. They've become a symbol of what we used to chase after. But now they serve as a reminder of how fragile things can be when you let greed drive your decisions. When I look at the younger traders today, I see something I didn't have when I was their age, a sense of caution. They're smart. They ask questions. They don't just follow the crowd. They understand that there's no such thing as a quick fortune, and that's something I've come to appreciate. They've been taught the lessons we learned the hard way, and in some ways I envy them. They're entering a world where they don't have to repeat the mistakes we made, but at the same time, there's a part of me that knows they'll face their own challenges. The world of finance is always changing, and there will always be temptations to cut corners, to take risks that seem too good to be true. I hope they remember the tulips. I hope they remember how quickly everything can vanish, how easy it is to get caught up in the illusion of wealth. But I believe they will. Because, just as I had to learn the hard way, they've learned from us. I still spend my days in the quieter corners of the city, watching the world move on, watching the markets grow steadily, but without the reckless energy they once had. There's something peaceful about it, something reassuring. I don't need the excitement of watching prices rise and fall. What I need now is stability. And as strange as it sounds, I found it in the slow, steady rhythm of life after the storm. The city has rebuilt itself, yes, but so have I. We all have. We've learned to be patient, to appreciate the value of things that take time to grow. The tulips are gone, but the lessons they left behind will stay with us forever. And maybe that's the real treasure. Not the money we lost or the fortunes we dreamed of, but the wisdom that came from the crash. The wisdom that tells us that wealth isn't just about what we accumulate, but about how we build, how we grow, and how we learn from our mistakes. So here I am, looking out at the city I've come to love even more in its quiet recovery. The tulips may be gone, but they've left a legacy that will live on, not in the memories of lost fortunes, but in the way we've rebuilt, stronger and wiser than before. It's strange how things can change so much yet feel so familiar. Amsterdam is not the same city it was before the Tulip Mania, but in many ways it's still the same at its core. The streets are still bustling, the markets are still alive with activity, and the ships still come in from all corners of the world, bringing goods and riches. But there's a difference now. There's a level of caution, a careful optimism that wasn't there before. The excitement of the tulip market, the madness of it all is gone. People don't talk about tulips the way they used to. They've become a symbol of a time we'd rather forget, but a time we also can't ignore. We learned so much from those days, the kind of lessons you don't forget no matter how hard you try. When I look at the younger traders now, I see a new energy. They're eager, driven, but they don't have the same reckless ambition we once had. They've learned from us, from the mistakes we made. They've been taught not to chase quick wealth, but to build slowly, steadily, with a long-term vision. And in that I see hope. The city is in good hands. I often think back to the time before the crash. It seems like another life now, almost as if the madness of the tulip bubble was a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. The pain, the loss, the anger, it was all real. People lost everything. And for what? A flower. So stupid flower. But over time I've come to understand something important. We didn't just lose money. We lost our sense of perspective. We let greed blind us to what really mattered. We got caught up in the idea that wealth could be ours without effort, that fortune could come from nothing. But it doesn't work like that. It never has and it never will, and now here I am. A little older, a little wiser, and with a quiet kind of contentment. I no longer chase the idea of getting rich quick. I've built my life back, slowly, carefully, with investments that make sense. No more tulips, no more bubbles, just steady growth. The kind that takes time and patience. The tulips are gone. But the lessons they left behind have stayed with me, and I'll carry them with me for the rest of my life. The city may have moved on, but I think I've found peace in the steady rhythm of life now. There's no more rush, no more wild speculation, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that what I've built is real, that what I have is lasting, and maybe in the end, that's all that matters. Because in the world of finance, in the world of wealth and ambition, the one thing that survives is what's built on solid ground. And that, after everything, is the greatest lesson of all. It's hard to believe how much has changed. The Amsterdam I see today is a far cry from the city that once buzzed with the fever of speculation and the scent of tulips. I remember the excitement, the rush of it all, the way people seemed to think they could make their fortune in a moment. But that wasn't real wealth. We all learned that the hard way. Looking back now, I realize just how fragile everything was back then. The market was built on air, on hope and greed, and when it all collapsed, it took so much with it. The tulips, which once seemed to promise endless riches, became a symbol of our collective folly. But as much as it hurts to remember, I know the crash taught us something invaluable. Wealth isn't something that comes without effort. It's built piece by piece, and it takes time. I think about the younger traders I see around now. They're different from us. They've learned the lessons we were too blind to understand at their age. They don't rush, they don't chase after fleeting wealth. They've got a steadiness to them, a careful optimism. They ask questions. They think about what they're investing in, not just how much money they can make in a few weeks. They're focused on building something real. In many ways, I feel proud of them. They're going to do things differently. They're going to build on solid ground, not on the shifting sands of speculation. They're going to make mistakes, of course, because that's how you learn. But I hope they remember what we went through, the risks of letting greed take control. As for me, I found a kind of peace I never had before. The hustle, the constant chase for the next big opportunity. It doesn't excite me anymore. I don't need that anymore. What I need is stability, something I can rely on. And I found it in small investments, in steady work, in building a life that's real. The tulips may be gone, but the lessons remain. They're part of who I am now, part of how I see the world. I'm not the same person I was before the crash, and neither is the city. Amsterdam is quieter now, but there's a sense of strength in that quiet. People don't expect to get rich overnight. They know better now. They know it takes time, and in the end, that's what matters. It's not about the quick wins or the instant success. It's about building something that lasts, something that's built on patience and wisdom. And as I watch the next generation, I can't help but feel a sense of hope. The future might be uncertain, but I'm confident that we've learned from the past, and that's a lesson worth holding on to. It's hard to describe the peace I feel now, especially when I think back to the chaos of the Tulip Mania. So much of my life was spent chasing after something that seemed so attainable, so sure. The promise of easy wealth, the hope that with a little risk I could find fortune, all of it felt so real at the time. But now as I sit here in the quiet aftermath of it all, I can see things so much clearer. Amsterdam has changed. I've changed. There was a time when the markets were the pulse of the city, and every conversation seemed to revolve around stocks, shares, and the next big trade. Now it's different. People still work, still trade, but there's a carefulness to it. It's like the entire city has taken a collective breath. The madness of the tulip bubble, that brief but intense burst of optimism, has passed. And in its place, steady growth, caution, patience. I've seen it in the younger traders, the ones who came into the world of finance after the crash. They don't have the same hunger we had. They ask questions, take their time, and consider every decision before they act. They've learned from us, from our mistakes, and that's the greatest gift we could have given them. They know that wealth doesn't come quickly. It's built, slowly, thoughtfully. Sometimes I find myself reflecting on the lessons we learned the hard way. The tulip bubble wasn't just about the loss of money. It was about what we lost as a society. Trust, for one. We learned how fragile the things we thought were certain really are. But we also learned about resilience, about the ability to rebuild, to learn, and to move forward. I think about my own journey. The investments I made after the crash weren't flashy. They weren't filled with the hope of instant wealth, but they were steady, real. I no longer chased after the illusion of quick gains. Instead, I built something small and solid. It wasn't the fortune I once dreamed of, but it was something that gave me peace. And that's enough. The tulips are gone, but their legacy remains. They're part of the history of this city, part of the story that has shaped who we are now. A cautionary tale, sure, but also a testament to the strength of a community that learned from its mistakes and rebuilt from the ground up. And as I look out over Amsterdam today, I feel a quiet pride, not just in the city, but in the people, in the younger generation that's rising, making thoughtful, responsible decisions. They're building something that will last, something built on the lessons of the past, not the mistakes. Maybe that's the real beauty of it all. We didn't just survive the tulip bubble. We grew stronger from it. And that strength is what will carry us forward. The years have passed and Amsterdam has found its balance again. The Tulip Mania is a memory, a lesson etched into the city's history. We've all moved on, but we've moved forward wiser, more careful with our investments, and more aware of the risks that come with speculation. The wild ambition that once ruled the markets is now tempered by the knowledge of what happens when you gamble with too much hope. For me, it wasn't about the wealth anymore. The crash taught me that real success isn't measured in how much you can accumulate, but in how carefully you build what lasts. I've spent my time since then focusing on the steady, the real, the things that hold value over time. And while I'm not as rich as I once dreamed of being, I'm content. I've seen the younger traders, the new generation, taking their time, building slowly. They don't make the same mistakes we did. They've learned from our rise and fall, and I have faith they'll keep building wisely. The tulips are gone. Their legacy nothing more than a cautionary tale. But we've moved forward stronger, with a deeper understanding of what true wealth means. As I look out at the city now, I know that the next chapter will be different. Not because of the absence of the tulips, but because we've learned the value of patience, of building something real.